that is stimulating the kind of debate that I think needs to happen. And she's produced countless numbers of documentaries that have done that, not least the most recent one, which has stimulated much of what she's going to talk about. And in no equal measure, she is also an Olympian, I think, doing one of the hardest things that I think any of us could choose to do, which is row a boat as fast as you can for a kilometre or 2 kilometres. So I'd like to welcome Mary onto the stage. I'm very grateful to have you.
How are we doing tonight? My friends on the other side of the pond. Are we going to roll the trailer? Should we roll the trailer? Okay, I'll come up after the trailer. How's that?
This is the United States. There's no possible way this is true.
They sent her out with one of her friends, and she didn't come back. Next thing you know, he brought her into a life of hell.
It's like shopping on Amazon.
It's just a product.
The most popular internet site for escorts is called Backpage.com, where authorities say underage girls are sold for sex.
Backpage is the Walmart of human trafficking. It's an incredibly profitable business.
We will never be the family we were before she was sold on that website.
We need someone to give us the fighting chance.
What if it was your daughter? How would you feel then?
It's a very important case. Are these people wholesaling children in Washington State or not?
I'd like to meet a member of the judiciary or a member of Congress that thinks that status quo is satisfactory.
I'd like to call the CEO of Backpage, Carl Ferrer.
I've never seen anything like that.
What are they hiding?
This hearing is adjourned.
There is a question as to what kind of society we're going to be. Whether we're going to tolerate sexual trafficking in children. That is in front of everything that we believe.
I want my daughter to hold her head high and know that none of this was her fault.
I am Jane Doe. I am Jane Doe. It's time for us all to stand up and be strong. I am Jane Doe.
So thank you, my friends. Thank you, Emer, and Matt, and Paul, and to the Federation, to the Open UR Network, and the co-op as well. I'm delighted to be here. Tell me if I start rustling. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this project came about, and then where we are today. This actually started when I read a story in the Boston Globe, back of the metro section. It was literally this big by this big. And the title of the article said, Ropes and Gray, which is a total, 1900s, 1800s law firm, white wingtip, place, represents Jane Doe's suing Backpage. And I remember thinking at the time, 3 things. Representing Jane Doe, who are these children? Why are they suing Backpage? And Backpage, for many of you, if you don't know, it's sort of been the notorious go-to website for commercial sex of all kinds, including the sale of children. And at the time, I remember thinking what really caught my eye was that Ropes and Gray lost, right? Case dismissed. And that's really when we jumped in. And I remember thinking, Judge Stearns in federal district court dismissed the claims of these children against Backpage. How is it possibly legal in today's day and age in the United States of America that it is legal to post ads selling children? What rabbit hole have we gone down? So that's really was the start, was bumping into this little 2x2 article. and thinking, wow, we're here at the intersection of possibly freedom of speech, technology, harm to children, and little did I know where we would actually go. So we jump in, you know, full of vim and vigor, and I go meet John Montgomery, who is the lead lawyer for these Jane Does in Boston. And John's, you know, super, like, he's got the tie, he's managing partner of 1,000, 2,000 lawyers. And I said, John, this is a fascinating case. I think there's been a grave miscarriage of justice. Like, let's talk about this. And he was like, grave miscarriage. And I said, I'd like to do a project. The first thing he said was, and I'd like to follow the Jane Does, and oh, by the way, there are other cases happening. I'm going to follow them too. And the first thing he said was, can we review the film before it comes out? Right? Totally cautious lawyer. And I said, and no. And he was really wonderful. He sort of took a deep breath and he said, I think there are really compelling issues. Like, let's do this. I also had the opportunity to speak with Backpage's general counsel, Liz McDougall. And originally, for those of you that haven't seen I Am Jane Doe, we tracked the story not just of the Boston case that I'm talking about, but several Jane Does around the country that filed suit against Backpage. And Liz McDougall is and has been the general counsel of Backpage. And I had a conversation with Liz McDougall, would you be willing to participate in this documentary? And early on the answer was yes, which I thought would have been a illuminating conversation. As things began to heat up, there was a Senate investigation that began to ramp up. She ultimately declined. And this really presented an interesting opportunity because I was then able to go meet the Jane Doe children themselves. And that was a game changer. I had one kid, she was the first Jane Doe to have ever filed suit in 2010. She was 13 years old when she was left behind. She snuck out for an after-school party, found herself at a fast food restaurant that night, 13 years old. Her friend gets into a car with 4 adult men. She says to herself, I don't think I'm gonna do that. I shouldn't do that. So she's left behind at a Hardee's. She's kind of teary because she's not supposed to be missing, you know, she's not supposed to be out of the house, and a woman approaches her. The woman says, can I give you a ride home? 6 hours later, she's up on Backpage. 13 years old. And she said to me, she said, why would I ever want to tell my story again? I have been spending the past 7 years trying to forget what happened. What good is this going to do me? What good is this going to do anybody? And I said, oh my God, like, it's on. She has just laid down the gauntlet. And I said, here's what I'm going to promise you. I will do everything in my power to take your voice, to take your story and elevate it so that people understand what's happening and the gravity of the issue. And she looked me up and down and she said, do you have a daughter? I said, yes, I have a daughter. She said, I'm going to do this for your daughter. Would your daughter do this for me? I remember thinking, my heart just, right? And I thought, I now have a greater responsibility with this project than I had ever believed possible. And these Jane Does, not just her, but the Jane Does that I met, which now are scores and scores of them, they were the wings with which I had throughout the entirety of the project. And this really became their story. As we were jumping into the project, it was then that I learned, so I originally thought it was going to be sort of a really interesting legal conundrum. I meet the Jane Does and understand it's something far greater. And then, of course, I get acquainted with the actual breadth and scope of the crime. And in America, I'm sure many of you are acquainted here, but in America, the Department of Justice estimates there's about 2 million, some, you know, plus or minus, homeless and runaway children on the street at any one time. Most advocates will agree that 15% of those children will be victimized. So you do the math, it's not good, right? It's not a kid here or there. It's not a poor runaway. This is a crisis in terms of numbers of children. And that does not even include, in the United States, foster care children, who really serve as the pipeline to the sex trade. LGBTQ, children with an opioid problem, children with an alcohol problem, children with depression, children with anxiety, right? And it occurred to me that this was a crisis that was just simply hidden in plain sight. The other really fascinating thing is the nature of the crime. And according to the National Center in the United States for Missing and Exploited Children, a huge majority of these children are, of course, sold online. And the rates of this are exponentially increasing. Not only that, but children have become largely invisible. You know, they used to be with other traffic victims, so, you know, walking the track, the police would know sort of who, what, where. Now, many of the children report that they are sold 15, 20 times a day, and they are confined to a hotel room. And one victim said to me, you know, what was fascinating was on the street, we could kind of keep track of one another. When we went online and went into hotel rooms, it was almost a prison because you just saw the ceiling, right? That was it. So I think the nature of the crime has changed dramatically with technology. So we then jump in, we start filming, and I will never forget going to the hearing in Boston. John Montgomery had appealed his loss, and we were headed to, they were headed to an appeal in front of the First Circuit. And on loan to the First Circuit was Justice Souter. He had served as a US Supreme Court Justice, right, the highest level you can get. And I'll never forget when Justice Souter turned to John Montgomery and said, hey, Mr. Montgomery, let me understand the difference between what a publisher might do to incentivize a Great Washington Days car sale and what Backpage is doing to encourage a thriving sex trade. I'm like, did I hear that? Did I just hear him compare children to cars? And I thought he's either incredibly provocative or fundamentally out to lunch, completely obtuse, completely ignorant. And I remember sitting through that hearing, like I'm so bad at like a natural born heckler. I had to remove myself because I was afraid I was going to start heckling the judges. They kept referring to the crime as the venture of trafficking. The venture of trafficking, as if it's a joint venture. And I remember thinking, you know, it's serial rape. Nobody used the word rape throughout the entire hearing. And I think that sort of, you know, feeds back to the cultural problem that we're seeing. We also, and I think many of these judges, they're older, they're white, some have very little acquaintance with the internet. And I think that they're imbued with this sort of cultural idea of pretty woman. You know, that this is consensual, it doesn't happen that often, blah, blah, blah. We saw this on full display in another Backpage related case, and I remember we grabbed the audio because the audio subsequently disappeared. And it was Judge Posner in the Seventh Circuit. And this was a slightly different case. This was not a child filing suit against Backpage, but this was Backpage filing suit against this rogue sheriff in Chicago, because the sheriff had taken stationery. He's a sheriff, right? A local sheriff. And he said, dear Visa and MasterCard, you know, you are in business with a known human trafficker. You must cease and desist, right? Well, that language became very important later on. And Backpage sued him and said, you are a government official. You are trampling our First Amendment rights. Like, we need to shut you down and stop this. And the sheriff won his case. The lower court judge said, well, the sheriff does have First Amendment rights himself. Excellent point. And that was appealed, Backpage appealed, and Judge Richard Posner, who is like the giant of jurisprudence. Every lawyer wants to think like Judge Posner. We all read him in law school. He literally said, oh, he was hounding Backpage's lawyer. I mean, kind of screaming at her. And I can't hear you, speak up. And I thought, oh, this is not going well for the sheriff's lawyer at all. And he said, you know, haha, sort of an old man, creepy laugh. He said, and I don't see what's wrong with an older man renting a young woman to have on his arm. Like, what's wrong with that? And phone sex, and off he goes, right? And it was shocking to not only listen to that audio and hear sort of the giant of jurisprudence talk about this idea that an old man is renting a younger woman to have, if only that were the crime. And so I think that sort of underscores the cultural problem that we have around really the crime in general. You know, that prostitution is really no big deal. Child sex trafficking, whatever. And I remember then reading his opinion, Judge Posner's opinion. It gets worse. He goes off on a frolic of his own. He's talking about S&M. He's talking about foot fetish. I mean, it was just absurd. And his conclusion was, if Backpage had 1% of legal activity, right, the foot fetish people, then the whole site is protected, which was just an amazing, shocking analysis. And Backpage itself had, until we get to present day, been on an extraordinary winning streak. They had lawyers that money can't pay for. I mean, the finest lawyers, and many, many of them. And they had used an internet freedom law in the United States to really be on this winning streak. And we saw it on full display in Boston and Chicago and elsewhere. And it's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And it was enacted at the dawn of the internet. And it was response to this great case where The Wolf of Wall Street, you guys know Jordan Belfort, Leonardo DiCaprio. So this guy, somebody writes on Prodigy, which was one of the older message boards. It would take you 10 minutes to dial up. And so somebody wrote, these guys at Oakmont Stratton, or Stratton Oakmont, we think they're manipulating Steve Madden's stock. We think they're crooks. Well, the firm got pissed off, said, we're not crooks, and sued Prodigy. And they walked away with legal fees, and they won, right? And they said, you are just like a newspaper, you're like radio, you're like television, you are responsible, you missed this comment, we're not crooks. Well, it's hilarious because they end up being crooks, right? So there's that. And Congress shortly thereafter enacted Section 230 among a broader Communications Act, which ironically was intended to protect children from online indecency, most of which was struck down. 230 remained. And 230 basically said, if you are hosting third-party content of any kind, guess what? You can pass go, you can collect $200, you have an entirely free pass, you have no liability. So your friends in TV, your friends that are doing magazines, your friends in radio, yep, they have to suffer, they have to take responsibility, but you, because we're trying to encourage the growth of the internet. And in many respects, I think that decision was really interesting because it's true, right? All of a sudden, unshackled by the normal costs of doing business, you've seen the internet explode, particularly American companies. Google, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter. None of them have had to bear the usual costs of doing business. And they have done many, many good things. However, in Boston, the decision of the First Circuit was then rendered. And the court went on to say, and after hearing the arguments, the Ropes and Gray team, they were pretty optimistic that they would win this, right? They're like, we think the judges are asking really provocative questions. I'm like, I got a bad feeling about that guy Souter who just talked about cars. I don't know how you guys are feeling, and in fact, you get the decision, it was like, wah, wah, case dismissed. And the court said, and this is what really ignited the iron, the court said, Backpage, even if you are actively and knowingly facilitating the crime of sex trafficking, in a sense, even if you're a co-conspirator, case dismissed, everybody goes home. And that was the decision. They took this old internet law that was really focused on defamation, right? You can't say nasty shit about other people and be held liable, right? Because that makes sense. Why should Facebook or anybody else be held liable for stupid comments? This took it to a whole new level. All of a sudden, you as a website could be engaged in criminal conduct and no liability. And I remember thinking, you know, what an incredible, obtuse, ridiculous decision to really suggest that Congress intended for websites engaged in criminal behavior to be protected. Does this make any sense? No, this makes no sense. But to their credit, in a later part of the opinion, the court wrote to the children, go get this changed. You need a legislative response, go to Congress. That decision, and it was a radical extension of this internet freedom law by the First Circuit, put everybody in motion. So we come out with our film, and Backpage is still winning everything. And a Senate investigation is starting to ramp up. And meanwhile, just before, so we actually had to, we were doing theaters in February of last year, and I get this call from Washington, D.C., and we had attended one hearing where they were just starting to look at online sex trafficking, and of course it led, you know, straight to Backpage. And I got a call saying, we think the Backpage executives are going to show up. Backpage executives had refused to show up to any previous congressional hearings, which was, if Backpage made one or two colossal mistakes, that would have been one of them. Because when you don't show up to Congress, like, the results just aren't going to be good. Anyways, they all show up, and we're doing theaters the following month. So the film is done, as far as I'm concerned. And then it's like, we think the executives are going to show up. So we're like, oh my God, we got to pull the film back, and we go to Washington. Sure enough, they all appear, and they take not only the Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination, but they also assert the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And I thought, this is wild. I didn't know you could ever, I'm sorry, officer, I assert my First Amendment right to speak. So that was a really extraordinary display to see them all really silent. And the mothers were given the opportunity to testify, and they did so in such moving and profound ways. So there was a congressional screening. So we're like 24/7 now to stay on track because we have a theatrical date. And we have an opportunity to have a congressional screening with members of Congress. And I was on a panel with Rob Portman, John McCain, Claire McCaskill, Heidi Heitkamp, and Richard Blumenthal. They are among the most powerful senators in America. And so we're talking about the film, and Rob Portman said, you know, I think our job is done. We're going to refer this to the Department of Justice. It's clear we've uncovered evidence that Backpage was complicit. They've been taking ads and scrubbing indicia. Like if the pimp put Lolita or Amber Alert, which was an underage child, you know, having gone missing, or Fresh, or Off the Boat, or Schoolgirl, like Backpage filters, there was evidence that Backpage filters would scrub that and then post it anyways. So they'd scrub the indicia of the child and post it anyways. And I remember saying to Rob Portman, I said, so what are we going to do here about this Section 230 thing? What are we going to be doing? What are we going to do about this Boston decision where a website now can engage in criminal activity and have no liability? Like, what up with that? And he said, you know, good question. Let's talk about this. So the very next day, we have a congressional briefing. And a House member, Ann Wagner, Republican from Missouri, she was great. She was a firefly. She said, I'm going to introduce legislation. We need to hold criminal actors that are websites accountable. This is reasonable. No, you know, the tech community has not allowed us to update this internet freedom law, which is now, you know, it's a Teflon shield at this point. And she said, I'm going to do it. And we said, you know, yay, go ahead. And then Dick Blumenthal showed up and he said, we're going to introduce legislation in the Senate. Ann Wagner goes and does her thing. Nobody's really, there's no controversy yet. She's kind of quietly doing her thing. Fast forward to August of last year. Portman, McCain, McCaskill, Heitkamp, Cornyn, and Blumenthal get together, the Gang of Six. They introduced legislation to amend Section 230 so that if you're hosting third-party content, but you yourself as a website are knowingly facilitating the crime of sex trafficking, a victim can sue you. You think, okay, that's a tiny little tweak, right? Like, sounds reasonable. It literally was like a bomb went off. And all these Google-funded groups, oh, have I mentioned Google yet? I'm getting there. So all of these, before I get to this, one of the shocking things that we discovered in the course of making film was, I'm an ex-lawyer, which is like super irritating to so many people around me, but I start reading all the pleadings and all the amicus briefs, and I see this brief by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Center for Democracy and Technology. I think to myself, oh yeah, they're probably, you know, free speech absolutists, I'm sure of it. Well, you Google them, and who do you think their primary funder is? Anyone? Right? And I remember thinking, well, Google must not know. I literally thought that. Google must not know how wrong I could have been. It was shocking to discover that in Google's quest to remain as profitable as possible, absent any regulation whatsoever online, that they would provide aided comfort and support to Backpage. Because Backpage's legal defense, I saw judges swayed by what came out of those amicus briefs. Google was operating behind this. Google and its Google-funded groups were operating behind the scenes to ensure that nothing would happen to this sacred, you know, get out of jail free card. So the legislation is introduced and all the Google-funded groups are going crazy. And then Google, which is atypical, comes out from under its carapace. Google very rarely operates sort of, you know, with transparency. And somebody in place in their policy group sent an email to every member on the Hill. The sky is going to fall in. You know, freedom, the freedom of the internet is at risk. Free speech is in peril. You know, blah blah blah. And I remember thinking at the time, you know, we have done our job. The film has raised awareness. It's catalyzed legislation. Like, you know, oh my God, right? Like, and we started fielding calls because we had this sort of like natural ecosystem around the film. And at first, I will tell you, it was very like, you know, please give us 5 stars. We're on Netflix, by the way, everywhere. Give us 5 stars on Netflix, like see the movie, buy a ticket, you know. It was self-serving, right, to create sort of this ecosystem. But then all of a sudden we had an ecosystem and we started fielding calls like, how are we going to respond to Google? Like, what are we going to do? They're going to tank this. And all of its Google-funded groups, how are we going to respond? And I remember thinking, how are we going to respond? How are we going to respond? And what was amazing was a coalition began to come together that was naturally part of the ecosystem. And these were people who really had not worked together in any formal way before. And so there were hundreds, thousands of people represented. And you saw some leaders of NGOs really start to bubble up to take leadership. And there were conference calls and a strategy put into place. Well, what are we going to do? In the Senate bill goes forward, partly because Backpage had blown them off, right? Step number one. And number two, tech was coming at them really hard. So I think they were almost too aggressive. And these senators were like, look, this is now a public issue, right? This is in the press. There's a movie, like there is an urgency to respond to this decision in the First Circuit. We can't not do anything. And I think Google thought they'd be able to shut it down. And when it became clear, this moved out of committee in the Senate unanimously, it was going to be headed for a vote. They had already had they had 66 commitments on a bipartisan basis, which meant it was going to pass the Senate. So all of a sudden, we're like, oh my, like, how is this happening? We had this like little ragtag team against extraordinarily well-funded pockets, like, and all of a sudden, we see Ed Wagner's bill in the House, and poof, it's gone. Literally disappeared between Christmas and New Year of last year. And again, like all the calls are coming in and the little focus, you know, several heads of these NGOs are like, we need a strategy. Google has just killed it. They have, in the House, you have many, many more members, and it's really easy to kill legislation in the United States in the House. And that's exactly what happened. There was a replacement bill that sought to not touch Section 230, but instead amend an outdated, controversial interstate prostitution bill. So the shift was away from the issue of child sex trafficking and sex trafficking to a referendum on prostitution. Well, we all know where that's going, right? And amazingly, the NGOs came up with a 6-week plan. And that included a PSA that we did with some famous people, Seth Meyers and Amy Schumer and other celebrities in New York, that we literally did on 2 cents. And that went viral. I think over 1 million people saw that in 48 hours. And people were it was like, call your member of Congress, Section 230 has to be amended. And like phone lines were going crazy. And what was fascinating was that it was seen over 1 million times, and yet if you check the Google rankings, where is the PSA? I mean, it was amazing to see the tweaking of algorithms in real time in terms of this debate. And that's when it occurred to me, free speech is being imperiled, right? When you have the result rankings, and a number of people were like flooding us with this information. A lot of people were observing this, that anyone that was opposed to the legislation, right, their rankings rose, and anybody that was supporting the legislation for change, like you couldn't find it. And in any event, the legislation got back on track. Shockingly, a few weeks later, after survivors from across the country flew into Washington, D.C., organized themselves, mothers roved up and down, members of the House, to get it back on track. And that saved the day, right? People of ordinary means, channeling great trauma, said, this cannot continue. And that saved the day. The bill was saved by House leadership, Kevin McCarthy, a representative from California, Mimi Walters, and it was back on track. The president signed this legislation last month. And there was some question as to whether it would happen. It happened. And I will tell you, I don't agree with most of our president's policies, but that day, he had 30 survivors. I was privileged to be there. There were about 30 survivors, and he was kind, and he was compassionate to them. And the bill passed. And now, and I'm going to turn it over to our panel, what we're seeing now is, given this setback for Google, and I must also say Facebook did a complete turnaround, and Facebook, I know they've got their challenges and their troubles. They came right before the catastrophe in the House when the bill disappeared. Facebook said, we support you, we support this issue, this is a very reasonable update to this law, we need to be a leader and be up front. Now, some might say that was opportunistic, as the Russian probe was, you know, right around the corner, but come around they did. And in fact, we had signals from Sheryl Sandberg that she was going to do everything she could to make this happen, and this was before the Russian scandal broke. So I think Facebook made it happen. They were good to their word. And now we're seeing tech forces shift their sights now to NAFTA and European trade agreements to include intermediary protections. Basically, what I call exporting our back page problem. So the fight continues, and I think we are, we're still sort of in the middle of this. So with that, I think I would just say one little thing, and that is about one other thing. 2 weeks ago, a 93-count indictment was unsealed against Backpage executives, which provide sort of extraordinary satisfaction to all of the families that have been fighting Backpage. And we released a short called I'm a Little Red with, that was written by the guys from Toy Story, and it's a 10-minute short for children that we're now rolling out. So I think I'm brilliant. Talk to the crowd.
I mean, that is an
extraordinary.
We have happily.
Did I lose anybody?
No, I think we have happily listened for a very, very long time. I mean, I suppose I go back to where we started. The objective of this is obviously to include you as an audience, but I think the first thing is that, in a way, it's a thank you for putting your effort into a problem that has led to, I think, a global debate at a moment where so many things have happened in the last few months, things that have challenged Facebook to think about its role as a content creator, an amendment to an underlying legislation that has been in place for so long, that forces and stimulates the kind of questions and debate that I think we're all interested in participating in. So I guess it's an enormous thank you. So I'd like to just bring in my fellow panelists. So Paul is known to me in the sense that we work together at the Co-op, and Paul works spent 20 years in government, and the last few years has been leading our kind of work in campaigns and policy. And Craig, who works for Tech UK, is particularly interested in the area of technology and its application, but also has a fairly diverse job in the field. So I suppose before I open it up to the audience, I guess one of the questions that I have for both of you, and I think from different perspectives, is the first perhaps, Craig, is to think about what you feel the implications are of this conversation and the kind of role that technology can play, and the sort of things that you're doing that you feel may have an impact on this. And then Paul, I guess, to give you a bit of thinking time, to think about this sort of dimension of where do you feel business accountability exists, and perhaps contrast a little bit with the US and the UK. So Craig, if you give us a few thoughts on that would be fantastic.
So I wrote about Tech UK is the trade association for the UK tech and digital sectors. We have nearly 1,000 members covering the entire spectrum of what you can call technology, the cheesy one using chip to click. So from the semiconductor manufacturers to the people that make the machines that we all use, all the way up to cybersecurity companies, telco, big platforms, so Google, Facebook, and co members. And the element that I'll put is the environment and compliance program, which looks quite a lot at how tech is used to achieve major societal problems, including modern slavery. And plus, they were able to take you some of the amazing examples of where technology is being used to facilitate people's combating of trafficking and modern slavery crimes. But on the US-UK problem, it's probably still no expert in the US legal system. We have a very different framework here in the UK. So we have the Internet Watch Foundation, for example, that can take down images with 97% accuracy, I think, in an hour from the internet, and there's a fairly wide-ranging ability to do that. We work with the internet industry to bring that up, and that can include classified adverts as well. It works with the hosting companies, it works with the content providers. And as of a couple of years ago, it even had an expanded remit where it could proactively go out and search for child abuse content online and proactively take it down themselves. It took years to get the legal framework right, because technically they would be looking for child abuse content, which is illegal. They were able to sort that. And also the intermediary liability regime is very different in the UK. We have a lot of underpinning EU rules. We have some fundamental rights that are frequently applied for online cases, and we have quite old legislation that is still being used. Obviously, its applicability in the data age is questionable, but it's still being used, and it's still actually, delivering satisfactory court verdicts. So yeah, it's a very different regime. But I was going to say that, what I sort of push back is that technology is a reflection of society. I would say that the technology isn't making bad people do bad things. They are going to do that anyway, and the technology is reflecting the shift in how it's being done and trying to how you address that. And I think conversely, it's also a platform because, for example, Netflix, a big online platform, is hosting a film and probably done a great job of getting viewed by lots of people. And notice some of the examples and things that one of my favourite ones, if you look at transparency in supply chains, so a lot of blockchain operations at the moment, a lot of different tech being used to help companies map and understand what exactly is going on in the supply chains. And therefore, you can reduce the risk of not only modern slavery, but labour exploitation, the use of illegal materials, use of other crime types in the supply chain. You can actually map that and mitigate a lot of the impacts. It's a great example of how an AI platform is being built by a hotel chain. So they're mapping every single room in their hotel estate. And instead of going on a web camera picture, the AI platform will be able to identify what room that is in their entire multi-thousand room estate all over the world, and can alert the hotel authorities and the police for that.
So I guess the interesting thing, and I think this is at the heart of this debate, is that we know that capability is there. Right? So the technology exists to deal with many of the situations in the environments and to deal with the kind of issues that we've been talking about and Mary's been talking about. I guess the question is where the businesses sit in this spectrum. Because there, of course, are two dimensions here. There's a dimension of legislation, the operating frameworks in which we exist and the constraints. But of course, in many senses, what I think we've already proved to ourselves is that a lot of the legislative frameworks, not least the ones that we exist, have existed for a very long time in a rapidly changing environment. So one of the questions that I think, perhaps Paul, you can comment on this, is where do you think businesses should be sitting in this landscape? What do you think the role is of businesses within this landscape?
So I think in the UK, there's a very low bar here, which is that there's a piece of legislation on the statute book that businesses have to be compliant with. It's called the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Section 54 says you couldn't produce a statement. That's the will of Parliament. So there's a minimum compliance. 50% of the companies in this country who should have produced a statement have never produced a statement. Those that have, 2/3 are non-compliant. There's a very small number of companies and businesses, delighted that we've got one of them, who genuinely does the right thing. There's a minimum level of compliance. The point about government, I think, is that government have got to enforce legislation. It's not about having legislation on the statute book and asking to make NGOs to enforce it. Governments have got to enforce legislation, and they're not doing so. My fear. So I think there's a compliance point. If you don't enforce legislation, I think as a foreign civil servant, legislation will fall into disrepute. So the basic, all businesses should not view it as a triumph that they're doing work to stop slavery in their supply chains. That's a pretty low bar. But the more transformative thing, I think, is that businesses have got assets. And if those assets are deployed to support victims of slavery, become survivors of slavery, we have seen in the court through Project Like Future and other things that businesses do, where you can transform the recovery of those victims, to become survivors and to thrive in societies in which they live. So I think the challenge for business is whether it wants to do the absolute minimum, or it wants to play a role in helping those who are most exploited. And I think some of this is around the language that is used around this. So in the UK, we talk about modern slavery. You watch I Am Jane, and as we were saying before, very early on, trafficking of this kind is called out for what it is, multiple children. And I think there's a language that business has to accept and then decide what it wants to do.
Yeah.
But at the minute, the role of business is, is legally to be able to produce a statement that says we are trying our best. It's not a great badge one to say we try to keep people from being exposed in our supply chains.
So, just a final one, and then I'll sort of bring the audience in. Mary, what's your feeling on this? Because, I guess in truth, part of the debate is about what questions should we be asking ourselves? What should we be doing ourselves as businesses, as practitioners, as people operating in this space? So it'd just be interesting to know.
I think, certainly this audience is a younger audience, and millennials care a lot about companies and who they are and what they stand for in a way that is almost unprecedented. And the purchasing power is extraordinary, and yet very few people know that Google, for example, and Google-funded groups are all, that they are callous to the harm online. And it's follow the money. It's all about revenue. This idea, I think, they police content, that's their business model. And this idea that they do not know what's going on I'll monetize it, come to me. Oh, by the way, I don't want to know what you're doing. That is just, it's obscene. And in a modern day society, I think can no longer be permissible. So I think it's people understanding and holding Google to account.
Yeah. So listen, I'm just trying to sort of get a view of that kind of contrast in business' role. So it'd be really interesting to just open up and see if there are any questions, bills, thoughts, burning questions from the audience. Does anyone like to? Yes, please. You could just say your name and where you're from and question, that would be fantastic. And who you want to ask the question, whether it's a panel or one person.
That's a lot.
Just your name and question. Name and question.
Okay, I'm Fiona, and my question is, have we missed the boat in terms of businesses being able to survive without Google? So, had we caught this earlier, maybe there would have been somebody else that people could choose to be able to use their business to do their business. But now, it's a verb. It's it's the way of life. You Google things. So, can we?
Oh, my friend, you can Bing them. You can DuckDuckGo. Okay, DuckDuckGo sucks, but they don't track you. Google tracks your history everywhere you go. They know if you're looking for a medical problem. So there are alternatives. However, because you're going to call a company to account doesn't necessarily mean you have to fully boycott them. Even though I personally do. Well, kind of. See, even me, right? I'm like, DuckDuckGo, really? I can't find this, and then I have to I'll go to Bing first.
Well,
you must go to Google a lot.
Thank you, Tim. Firstly, the history is littered with businesses that were verbs who have now since disappeared. I think there's always a possibility. And I think part of this, certainly from my own perspective, is what does collective participation from a consumer perspective do to influence the shape of these platforms going forward? And I suppose part of my provocation here is, and of course I'm slightly biased given the job that I have, is that I do feel that a pincer movement is required, and there are three parts to that. There's a business part, a consumer part, and a government legislation part. And I think that ultimately that can influence and shape these platforms for the better. I don't know whether you wanted to comment on that question.
I think that three-part movement is right. I think different elements of that play roles at different times. So it may be that, and if you watch Iron Jane Doe, it's very much civil society, the victims or the parents, the ones in particular, or the charity support them that raise the issue, and then government have been responding through research, especially if we look at other issues in the sustainability field, be it plastics, as an example, or climate change. I think different actors play different roles at different stages. I wonder if, in specifics about Google, there are plenty of examples in history of where businesses did certain things for a period of time until it became unacceptable to do those things. And actually those business models changed. And so I do think that being conscious consumers, being curious consumers, asking and challenging why certain things operate, could, in the right environment, begin to change the way some business models are run. There's plenty of examples throughout history that
I mean, I can give a pretty good example of that, is the UK internet industry. So back in the 90s, when so there was a mass adoption of people signing up for dial-up accounts, there were a lot of concerns. A lot of bad things were happening online, as obviously there are now. But the sort of consumer, press, government, and they came together to create a coalition, and that's how we know the idea, for example, to remove any form of child abuse content from the UK-facing part of the internet. See, there are changes internationally that have used it's abroad, but they have done that, and that is a response to sort of consumer and sort of media pressure. But let's go back on the Modern Slavery Act. So one thing we actually found, and this is supported by the CEO of Unseen, which is the big kind of modern slavery NGO, is that the blank page of paper, the statement, actually got a lot more senior level buy-in from companies, because you have to actually sort of sit down on a bit of paper what you're doing. If you look at other areas that the government requires companies to report on, with climate change or carbon or other things, it's a tick box exercise. They didn't want to make a tick box exercise, so they had to sit down and what they had to do. Now, in a recent report we've done looking at how the tech sector has done in their statements, some of them were rubbish. Some of them were half a page long. There are some interesting examples with the company philosophies that they didn't see kind of people signing up to their actual websites as suppliers, but they didn't come from the supply chain. It's really wrong. But we've actually found high level impact, and we've got companies now in their second iterations, and we're hoping to see real improvement.
I think the truth is around Modern Slavery Act is the businesses that were always going to produce meaningful statements, like the Co-op, like John Lewis, like Marks and Spencer, have done so. The businesses that weren't going to do haven't bothered and aren't being enforced. And those that just want to play a game are playing a game. And so I absolutely recognise what Andrew says at Unseen. The reality is, until government does its job and enforces the will of Parliament, businesses, only the businesses that were always going to do something are going to do something. Yeah. Everybody else will do.
Brilliant. We bring some other people in, so
Stuart Hall, from Trinity. This is a question for Mary, really, but I thought it was incredibly powerful, compelling, energising. It was also made me feel a bit sympathetic to Donald Trump. But the question is, did you go after the legislators because you could encourage, shame them more easily than you could, shame and encourage businesses? Because stopping credit card use, you just get.
Great question. I think we had a two-pronged, three-pronged approach. So one of our executive producers of the film sat on a huge technology board. That gave us some really interesting access to have conversations with some very key tech companies. I wish I could tell you those conversations were more fruitful. They were not. However, it occurred to me that we interviewed a number of senators for the film, and there's something about Klieg lights that can also help raise the temperature around things. And so when the film came out, The response, precisely because so many Americans were unaware of the crime, and the scope of the crime, and that this was happening. I think, and the First Circuit decision, normally without a film or any sort of lights, that would have been, you know, dead and buried. Nobody would have known about the problem. So I think it's part and parcel, and certainly we found that legislators were very much open to the problem if you could articulate the urgency. So if you could say, look at the First Circuit decision, does this make sense? Can there be a change? Then, when they were working on this, they met extraordinary resistance. Craigslist lobbied up, lawyered up, Google, you name it, the place was crawling with lobbyists. And to see the influence of money in all of this was really extraordinary. And I don't mean just in Washington, D.C., but how these special interest groups operate. They lobby, even though they call themselves nonprofits or think tanks. And to see that money at work was really, it was really sobering. And I think the idea of motivating members of Congress was the only way forward. Like legislation, it's not like these companies were going to self-regulate. Many of them have said, oh, I have an AI tool, and I'm being such a good doobie because I'm working on this issue. Well, wait a minute, why did you start working on the issue? Is it when activists started calling to amend Section 230 in 2010? Is that when you started spreading your money into the anti-trafficking community? Like, let's call this what it is. So I think, and many tech companies do very good work in this field, but they give and they take. Some of them give and they take more than others.
Thank you. Just do a couple more questions if we can. Yes, back there. Keith. Oh, yeah, one there and one there. Thank you.
I'm Catherine from Co. I've actually got two questions. I'm going to be cheeky. One for Mary and one
for
cheeky.
You
only get one. Only one question, Catherine.
Okay, I'll go with Paul then. The opposite legislative legal environment is quite different in the UK to the US. What do we know about the scale and the nature of this issue in the UK, as in trafficking of children, sex? Do we understand what the scale of the problem is? And if it's and what are the root causes and what's the route to fixing it here, given that it's obviously quite different in states?
So there was a parliamentary select committee hearing about a month ago, the Public Accounts Committee, and if I summarise their view of the UK's knowledge of slavery issues, it basically said you don't know the numbers, you don't know the facts, you don't have any information to find out either. That's basically what the Public Accounts Committee said. You can Google it and it'll tell you.
You can Bing it.
Yes. Okay.
Just do one thing tomorrow, load of different searches.
Yes. We know that there are upwards of 30,000 people enslaved in the United Kingdom. We know that almost half of those are UK nationals, often with vulnerability, be it alcohol abuse, be it other substance abuse, be it homelessness, etc. We know that predominantly it is forced labour, it is domestic servitude, and it is sexual exploitation. We know that children are involved, okay, because they are found and they are rescued, and I've met a number of survivors who were trafficked as children into sexual exploitation. What we don't know, and what the National Crime Agency can't tell with any degree of certainty, is how some of those crimes are operating. So is it through an online portal? Is it through use of employment agencies? We've got examples of all of that. What I have never seen, and I spent in my 10 years in law enforcement, I get law enforcement, I get intelligence. I've never seen that public threat assessment that says this is the nature of the crime. And therefore, without that, is it about attacking businesses? Is it about attacking the internet? And I don't think the UK, and I quote Public Accounts Committee, not me, understand what the issues are.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for one more question. At the back, the lady at the back.
I think that's me.
Okay, yes it is. Yeah.
So I'm Mary. I'm a member of the Prop Council.
Okay.
I have a question that is for Paul and Mary. That feels a bit weird. Anyway, the question is, I think, firstly, I want to take a moment to celebrate all of the great work that Paul and his team have done, because I think it's been amazing. But also, I'd like to see what are we going to do next to amplify that, and where do we go next, both in the UK, not just the co-op, but also globally, how do we, how do we make progress there?
So I think let's Mary, where are you headed?
So, two things. We see the intermediary problem. First, it is happening here. It happened with Cracker and Viva Street and others in the UK. But we're seeing the tech lobby really insert this into trade agreements across the globe. That is a frightening proposition. Secondly, I think the bigger issue to tackle is prevention, because you can only rescue your way out of or law enforce a tiny fraction. And what does that mean? You're addressing housing instability. It's, as one person said, homeless and runaway youth day, you can hear crickets on the hill. Sex trafficking day, everybody shows up. It's the same population. So addressing the needs of these children, the homeless, the runaways, LGBTQ youth, anybody that is vulnerable is the primary concern. And we're working on, with our animated short, a prevention program. So that if children understand one of the 4 key ways a trafficker or a pimp will recruit them, and we can save one child, it's worth the whole exercise. And we wrote that with 10 survivors, and one survivor said to me, after seeing it, we just released it very recently, she said, Mary, if I had seen I Am Little Red when I was 10 years old, I would not be sitting here right now next to you.
So Paul, you've got a minute as well.
I think, so I absolutely agree with Mary. I think one of the issues for the UK, where we as a co-op should take this next, this is a human rights issue. If you make it, as we have in the UK, a law enforcement issue, you follow a certain path and you get into pumping money into investigation. That's absolutely right. You won't investigate the way out of this. No chance. You've got to address the structural issues. And there's some fundamental structural issues, both in the UK and globally, that makes trafficking a lucrative business. And I think what we need to do in the court is to be able to help change this debate from being a law enforcement debate to being a debate about human beings and human beings' rights. That's, I think, the big thing.
And just to touch on that, sorry, we're not touching this at all. It's how we objectify people in the media as well, and how it's constantly judging people and looking at them online and liking people on Instagram for having the perfect bodies. And you look at how the porn industry online.
Oh, here we go.
This is the big thing that no one's touched on. And this is key. It's how we objectify and get our kicks online straight away. So of course we're going to move that to buying whatever we want and getting it straight away. And that's the real issue that we've got to tackle.
So listen, I agree with that. When you have these kind of things, the richness of debate and the dimensions that we can go can never be covered in the amount of time we've got. There is plenty of time now afterwards. I guess my job really is to thank you for coming, thank you for the questions, but thank you to Mary for coming all the way from Boston. Thank you to panelists for showing up and participating, and then finally to the sponsors. Thank you very, very much.